At exactly 11:47 at night on my 30th birthday, my phone lit up. It was not a call. It was a text colder than my empty apartment, "Happy birthday." 7 days later, my family called, voices sweet as if they never forgot, begging for a signature to save their business. But the truly terrifying part was not that they needed me now. They had been secretly using my name for a very long time. My name is Maxine Mayfield. If you ask my family who I am, they will not tell you my favorite color, or how I take my coffee, or whether I am happy living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago. They will tell you I am the person you call when you need an ironclad pair of eyes. I am the daughter who proofreads the bank loan applications, the sister who smooths out the passive-aggressive tone in a crucial client email, the built-in consultant who reads the fine print on a vendor contract so no one else has to. I am the safety net. You do not ask how the safety net is doing. You just expect it to hold your weight when you fall. My teenage years took a sharp turn the year my mother, Elaine Mayfield, married Victor Kessler. We moved from our quiet, slightly worn-down duplex into a sprawling, newly vinyl-sided house in the suburbs of Indianapolis. Victor owned a mid-sized property renovation and repair company. It was not a corporate empire by any means, but in our neighborhood, it was enough to buy the illusion of local royalty. From the moment we unpacked our boxes, every ounce of oxygen in that house was funneled into maintaining the image of the successful, perfectly blended American family. Victor was the patriarch, loudly steering the business at the dinner table, dominating conversations with talk of zoning permits and contractor disputes. Braden Kessler, Victor's son from his first marriage, was the golden boy. He was aggressively groomed to take over the company despite having the attention span of a gnat and a profound allergy to hard work. Then there was Delaney, Victor's daughter, who was raised to be the shining face of the Kessler brand. She was the cheerleading captain, the sorority president, the girl whose flawless teeth and glossy hair looked perfect on the annual holiday cards we mailed to 200 of Victor's closest business associates. And then there was me. I was never subjected to anything as cinematic as overt cruelty. There were no locked doors, no screamed insults, no Cinderella moments of scrubbing floors while they went to the ball. My erasure was much more polite, much more insidious. I was simply, consistently, moved to the bottom of the priority list. I was the forgotten child, but the forgetting was spread out over 1,000 tiny infractions, none of which felt large enough to justify a tantrum. A missed choir concert here because Braden had a baseball game. A skipped parent-teacher conference there because Victor had a last-minute contractor meeting and my mother had to bring Delaney to a pageant fitting. "You are so low maintenance, Max," my mother used to say, patting my shoulder as she rushed out the door with her car keys jingling. "You always understand. Just help the family out a little." Okay, because I understood, and because I craved the meager crumbs of validation that came with being useful. I morphed into the family's invisible stagehand. I learned early on that taking up physical or emotional space was a liability. If Delaney needed $500 for a formal dress, she threw a fit and got it. If I needed $20 for a textbook, I found a part-time job at the local library. I equated silence with love. I thought if I never caused a problem, they would eventually reward me with genuine affection. But the world does not reward the quiet ones. It merely uses them. By the time I was 16, I was formatting bid proposals for Victor, fixing the margins and catching the math errors his estimators routinely glossed over. I was reading over the drywall estimates late at night at the kitchen counter. I was rewriting Braden's college application essays and, later, his professional emails, translating his crude, entitled demands into polished corporate speak. I was the grease in the gears of the Kessler machine. Essential but entirely unseen. I did the heavy lifting in the shadows so they could shine in the sunlight. The moment I clutched my college diploma, I packed my bags, crossed the state line, and never really looked back. I moved to Chicago and built a life that made sense to me. I took a job at Meridian Corridor Group, stepping into the cold, rigid, and deeply satisfying world of corporate compliance and procurement. It was the perfect fit for a girl who grew up monitoring the erratic behavior of the people around her. In compliance, there is no gray area. Things are either legally sound or they are a liability. I learned how to look at a 500-page vendor agreement and spot the single misplaced signature line that could cost a company $2 million. I learned to track the subtle, shifting patterns of corporate fraud. I looked for the padded invoices, the ghost employees, the backdated consent forms. My career trajectory was a straight line upward. I became a senior procurement compliance manager because of my absolute precision, my unnatural calm under pressure, and my ability to smell financial risk from 3 area codes away. I spent my days building walls of policy and regulation to keep bad things from happening to a corporation. I was good at it. I was respected. In the office, my voice carried weight. Yet, for all my professional armor, my private life was hollowed out by a very old, very pathetic ache. I had built a fortress of self-reliance in a high-rise apartment overlooking the grid of the city. But I still harbored the quiet, foolish hope that one day my family would look at me and actually see me. Not the editor, not the proofreader, not the free legal consultant, just Maxine. I wanted my mother to call me on a random Tuesday evening just to ask what I made for dinner, without pivoting the conversation to Victor's high blood pressure. I wanted Victor to ask about my day without following it up with a request to review a subcontractor liability waiver. I wanted Braden to send a text that did not start with an emergency favor because he had messed up a supply order again. I wanted to be loved for breathing, not just for functioning. I wanted to be a daughter, not a utility. As my 30th birthday approached, this quiet longing grew heavier, wrapping around my ribs like a tight bandage. Transitioning from your 20s to your 30s is supposed to mean something. It is a marker of true adulthood, a time when you are supposed to have your emotional house in order. I did not want a surprise party. I did not want a luxury gift. I did not need them to drive 3 hours up Interstate 65 to take me to an overpriced steakhouse in the Loop. My demands of the universe were embarrassingly small. I just wanted them to remember. I wanted to wake up on the morning of my birthday and see a message that proved I existed in their minds without a prompt. I spent the entire week leading up to the day practicing a bizarre form of emotional restraint. I did not mention the date in our group chat. I did not drop hints when my mother called on Monday to complain about the outrageous price of Delaney's wedding florist. I just listened to her vent, offered a few neutral sounds of agreement, and hung up. I held my breath, waiting to see if this year, finally, they would give me the one thing I could not earn through hard work or compliance audits. I wanted their unprompted attention. I wanted them to remember the girl they left at the bottom of the list. The glow of the city slipped through the blinds of my apartment, casting long, horizontal bars of light across the hardwood floor. I sat at the kitchen island. In front of me sat a single white cardboard takeout box from my favorite Italian place down the street, and a small, perfectly round vanilla cake I had purchased from a bakery on Clark Street. Next to the cake was my phone. It was placed meticulously in the center of the quartz countertop. Face up, screen dark, I watched it the way a hawk watches an empty field. I was waiting for a vibration, a ring, a flicker of light that would validate the day. I had turned 30. It was supposed to be a milestone. The day had started with a warm, steady rhythm of affection from people who shared my zip code but not my bloodline. At 7 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a long, overly enthusiastic voice note from Tessa Vale. Her voice was loud over the sound of a roaring espresso machine in the background, singing a slightly off-key birthday song and demanding we get drinks on Friday. At 8:15, as I locked my apartment door, Noah Mercer from across the hall was stepping out of the elevator. He handed me a spare cup of coffee he claimed he bought by mistake, gave me a crooked smile, and said, "Happy 30th, Maxine. Try not to work too late." By noon, a handful of old friends from college had sent thoughtful messages, asking about my life, hoping I was celebrating. People who owed me absolutely nothing had remembered everything. Yet, the channel from Indiana remained entirely dead. As the hours dragged on, my mind performed the same exhausting gymnastics it had perfected over the last decade. I built elaborate, sturdy excuses for my family. I told myself Victor was likely trapped in a grueling negotiation with a new subcontractor, and had lost track of the hours. I imagined my mother, Elaine, rushing around the suburbs, flustered and busy with the dry cleaning or Delaney's endless demands, planning to call me the second she sat down with a glass of wine. I convinced myself that Delaney was waiting for the evening to initiate a grand, chaotic group FaceTime call. I manufactured a dozen different scenarios where their silence was merely a byproduct of their chaotic, important lives, rather than a reflection of my value. But the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. The sky turned the color of bruised plums, and the streetlights flickered on, painting the walls of my apartment in artificial amber. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The hum of the refrigerator felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I ate my pasta in silence, the taste of garlic and olive oil turning to ash in my mouth. At 9 o'clock, I finally gave in to the masochistic urge that had been clawing at the back of my neck all day. I picked up the phone, not to call them, but to look. I opened the social media application on my screen, my thumb hovering over the glass before scrolling. The answer to their silence was not a crisis. It was a party. Braden's page was a brightly lit, obnoxiously loud digital billboard of celebration. He had launched his new restaurant chain concept that very afternoon. The first photo was a wide shot of a crowded, trendy dining room filled with balloons and floral arrangements. The caption read, "Building the Empire, one opening at a time." Could not do it without my rock-solid tribe. I swiped to the next photo. It was a candid shot taken near the bar. There was my mother, Elaine, wearing a tailored navy silk blouse, her head thrown back in a wide, unburdened laugh, holding a champagne flute. She looked radiant. She did not look like a woman who was too busy running errands to send a text. I swiped again. Victor was standing next to Braden, his arm slung heavily over his son's shoulder, holding his signature glass of bourbon. Victor's chest was puffed out with undeniable, consuming pride. I swiped one more time. Delaney was in the center of a group of well-dressed guests, holding her phone high to record a toast, her face illuminated by the ring light attached to her case. The timestamp on the first video showed they had been at the venue since 4 in the afternoon. They had been drinking, laughing, taking photos, and celebrating Braden for at least 5 hours. I sat frozen on my bar stool, the artificial light of my phone screen reflecting in my eyes. I stared at the digital evidence of my own insignificance. They all had the time. They had hours of it. They had the energy to dress up, to drive into the city, to pose, to smile, to toast to Braden's supposedly self-made success. They simply did not have a single minute to spare for the day I was born. A cold yet hollow sensation opened up in my chest, right beneath my ribs. It was not the sharp sting of betrayal, but the dull, heavy ache of a truth you can no longer outrun. I looked at the small, untouched vanilla cake on my counter. The contrast was almost brutally poetic, a towering champagne pyramid in Indianapolis, and a single slice of solitary sponge cake in Chicago. I placed the phone back on the counter. I did not turn off the screen. I watched the clock in the upper corner change. 10:30, 11 o'clock, 11:30. I watched the minutes bleed away, taking the last remnants of my 20s and the last shreds of my benefit of the doubt with them. At 11:47 at night, the screen finally illuminated with a new notification. It was a text message from Elaine. It read, "Was today your birthday? Happy 30th. Sweetheart. Crazy week." I stared at the glowing letters. I read the words over and over, letting the sheer inadequacy of them wash over me. A question mark, a casual, almost irritated realization. There was no phone call to apologize for the oversight. There was no panic in the tone. There was just a hasty, delayed obligation thrown over the digital wall 13 minutes before the day officially expired. It was a shield, a preemptive defense meant to block any right I might have to be upset. For 29 years, my conditioning would have taken over in this exact second. My fingers would have flown across the keyboard to soothe her guilt. I would have typed out the familiar, pathetic script. "No worries at all, Mom." I saw the pictures of Braden's launch. It looked like a crazy night. "Hope you guys had fun." I would have absorbed the blow, hidden the bruise, and made sure she did not feel like a terrible mother for forgetting her daughter. I would have played the easy child. Tonight, my fingers did not move. I looked at the message. I looked at the dark windows of my apartment. I reached out and pressed the power button on the side of the phone. The screen went black, plunging the kitchen back into shadows. I did not reply. I did not offer absolution. I sat in the overwhelming silence of my home, the cake completely forgotten. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to translate their neglect into a language of accidental oversight. I forced myself to swallow the jagged pill I had been avoiding since I was a teenager. Being forgotten was not an accident. It was not a scheduling error. It was exactly where I belonged in their hierarchy. I was a tool kept in the shed, only remembered when something in the main house was broken. The darkness of the apartment felt different now. It was no longer a waiting room. It was a boundary. As midnight struck, turning my birthday into just another ordinary Friday, a profound, icy shift occurred in the center of my chest. The girl who waited by the phone, desperate for a crumb of their attention, quietly packed her bags and left. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply made a decision in the quiet dark. I was done being the safety net. I was done being the person who materialized the second they dialed my number. If they wanted to forget I existed, I was finally going to let them. Exactly 7 days after the silence of my birthday, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my thumb across the glass. "Maxie," Elaine chirped, her voice dripping with a sugary enthusiasm that practically vibrated through the speaker. "How is my favorite girl doing in the Windy City?" I stared at the compliance spreadsheet on my monitor. "I am fine, Mom." "Oh, good, good. We have just been so incredibly busy down here. You know how the spring season gets. But we miss you." She paused, a beat too short for actual sincerity. "Listen, sweetheart, Victor is right here, and he has some incredibly exciting news to share." A rustle of fabric echoed over the line, followed by the hollow clatter of a speakerphone being engaged. "Maxine," Victor barked, his voice booming into the small confines of my office. "Hope you are having a productive Thursday. Listen, I will cut right to the chase." Victor never called unless the chase involved a favor. "We are looking at a massive municipal project," Victor continued, his tones swelling with the self-importance he usually reserved for country club mixers. "The city of Indianapolis is releasing a massive housing redevelopment package next month. We are talking millions of dollars in municipal contracts. It is the kind of anchor project that sets a company up for a decade." "Congratulations," I said evenly, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "Sounds like a lot of work for the estimators." "Well, that is the thing," Victor said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "The city has completely revamped their scoring matrix for these bids. They are aggressively prioritizing proposals from businesses with diverse ownership structures, specifically women-owned enterprises. If we bid under the current corporate structure, we lose 15 points right off the top. We will be dead in the water before the committee even opens the envelope." I stopped looking at my spreadsheet. The compliance manager in my brain snapped to attention. And, Elaine chimed in, her voice floating back toward the microphone. "We had the most brilliant idea. You have that gorgeous title now, Senior Procurement Compliance Manager. You have a spotless professional record. And, most importantly, you have the Mayfield name. We are setting up a new legal entity." Victor took over, bulldozing through her sentence. "Mayfield Civic Renewal. We want to list you as the managing member. 51% ownership. It is a brilliant strategic move." The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. I did not blink. "You want to put me down as the majority owner of a shell company to win a municipal contract? Do not use the term shell company, Maxine. It sounds terrible," Victor snapped, a flare of irritation piercing his salesman cadence. "It is a strategic subsidiary, and you will not have to do a single thing, not one. We are just putting your name on the operating agreement. It is purely on paper. We handle the operations, the bonding, the labor, everything. You just sign a few incorporation documents, and we keep the whole thing in the family. They were speaking the language of a hustle, completely unaware that they were pitching it to a woman whose entire career was dedicated to dismantling hustles. In the world of corporate compliance, there is no such thing as being the boss just on paper. If you own 51% of a company, you carry 51% of the fiduciary duty. When a municipal auditor finds a discrepancy in the drywall invoices, they do not care who actually hammered the nails. They look at the operating agreement. The figurehead is not a symbol. The figurehead is the first meat shield thrown to the wolves. Absolutely not, I said. The immediate, flat rejection hung heavily in the air. Maxine, my mother said, her voice tightening, the sugar dissolving instantly. Do not be difficult. Victor is offering you a chance to be a part of something huge. I am not being difficult, I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I am looking at this from a legal perspective. If there is a single violation, a single misallocation of city funds, the city does not sue Victor Kessler. They sue the managing member of Mayfield Civic Renewal. That is me. You are asking me to take on unlimited liability for a project I have zero operational control over. Oh, for heaven's sake, Victor groaned, the sound wet and heavy with disgust. Always the lawyer. Even though you never passed a bar exam, we have been doing this for 30 years. We do not make mistakes. This is a formality to get past a bureaucratic gatekeeper. If it is just a formality, put Delaney on the paperwork, I suggested smoothly. She lives 10 minutes away from you. Delaney does not have your resume, Victor shot back. She works in public relations. The city procurement board wants to see a serious corporate background. They want to see someone who looks like they know how to handle compliance. The irony was so sharp it physically hurt. They needed my compliance background to bypass compliance regulations. My phone buzzed against the desk. The screen lit up with a text message from Braden. I glanced down. It read, "Dad says you are dragging your feet. Stop overthinking. This is your chance to finally contribute to the family legacy instead of just hiding in Chicago." I read the text twice. Finally contribute. As if I had not spent my adolescence rewriting his term papers so he would not fail out of community college. I looked back at the blank wall of my office. "Let me ask you both a question," I said, my voice dropping an octave, shedding the polite veneer I had worn for 29 years. Last Friday was my 30th birthday. I sat in my apartment alone all evening. Neither of you called. You did not have 2 minutes to dial my number to see if I was alive. But today, because you need a clean background to secure millions of dollars in city funding, you suddenly remember my phone number. Why is a municipal bid worth a phone call? But my birthday is not. The line went dead quiet. I could hear the faint, hollow hum of the connection, the sound of the Indianapolis suburbs sitting in stunned silence. "Maxine," Elaine finally said. Her voice was cold, defensive, and entirely devoid of guilt. "Are we really doing this right now? Are you really bringing up a birthday text when we are talking about the future of the family business?" "Yes," I said. "I am. I sent you a message," she snapped, her volume rising to match her indignation. "It was a crazy week. Braden had his restaurant launch. Victor was dealing with the bank, and you are sitting there holding a grudge over a cake. You are being incredibly immature. You are making everything so dramatic." "I am not making it dramatic," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking slightly. "I am making it clear. I will not sign the operating agreement. I will not be the managing member of Mayfield Civic Renewal. Do not use my name on any of those documents." "You are being ridiculous!" Victor yelled into the speaker, abandoning the Patriarch Act entirely. "We are offering you equity. You are offering me liability," I corrected him. "And the answer is no." "Maxine, if you hang up this phone," my mother warned, her voice trembling with a potent mix of anger and disbelief that I was actually defying her, "you are turning your back on this family when we actually need you." "You do not need me, Mom," I said softly, the truth of it settling into my bones like lead. "You need a clean record. Find someone else's." I pressed the red button on my screen. The call ended. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my office rushing back in. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm of adrenaline and grief. I had finally said no. I had finally drawn a line, but there was no victory in it. My mother had not apologized. She had not even hesitated. When forced to choose between acknowledging my pain or securing a business advantage, she had attacked me for being too sensitive. The realization was not sad. It was chilling. They did not view me as a daughter who was hurting. They viewed me as a non-compliant asset. I turned my phone face down on the desk and looked back at my monitor. The numbers on the spreadsheet blurred for a moment before snapping back into focus. I had survived the confrontation. I assumed that was the end of it. I assumed, naively, that a firm refusal was enough to stop a family that had always done whatever it pleased. I had no idea that they had not called to ask for my permission. They had called to cover their tracks. 3 days after the phone call that severed the last fragile string connecting me to my family, the buzzer to my apartment rang. It was 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I did not expect any visitors. I pressed the intercom button and asked who was there. "It is Delaney," the speaker crackled. "I brought coffee." "Let me in. It is freezing out here." I stood in the entryway, my hand resting on the lock. I should have told her to leave, but a morbid curiosity, a need to see what angle they were playing now, won out. I buzzed her up. Delaney stepped off the elevator, looking like a walking advertisement for a luxury autumn lifestyle brand. She wore a pristine beige cashmere sweater, tailored trousers, and an expression of unnatural, practiced sisterly devotion. In one hand, she balanced a cardboard tray holding 2 massive iced lattes. In the other, she clutched a small, elegantly wrapped silver box. "Happy late 30th, Max," she said, stepping into my living room and placing the box on the coffee table. I know things got a little tense on the phone with Mom and Victor the other day. I wanted to come up and check on you. Just the 2 of us. I did not touch the box. I crossed my arms and watched her. "You drove 3 hours from Indianapolis on a Saturday morning just to bring me coffee and a late gift." "I was worried about you," she said, her large brown eyes projecting a rehearsed innocence. She sat down on my sofa, making herself comfortable. "You know how Victor gets when he is stressed about a project. He lacks tact, and Mom just wants everyone to get along." "They did not mean to make you feel pressured." "They did not pressure me," I corrected her coldly. "They demanded I assume legal liability for a shell company." "There is a difference." Delaney waved her manicured hand dismissively, taking a sip of her iced latte. "You are looking at it like a lawyer. Maxine, it is just business. Everyone does it. Anyway, I just wanted to say, you really should not be so mad. It is actually a compliment. Your name looks so good on the investor deck. Very authoritative." The apartment went entirely still. The ambient noise of the Chicago traffic outside my window seemed to vanish. "What investor deck?" I asked. My voice was dangerously flat. Delaney froze. The plastic straw slipped from her lips. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to me. She realized her mistake the second the words left her mouth. The glossy, perfectly curated public relations facade cracked, revealing the panicked amateur underneath. "Nothing," she stammered quickly. "Just some preliminary mock-ups. Internal stuff Victor was playing around with to see how the pitch would look. It does not matter since you said no. Open your laptop." "Delaney," I commanded. "Max, I do not have it on me." "Open your phone, then." I stepped closer to the sofa, towering over her. "You are the head of public relations for the company. You have every promotional asset saved on your cloud drive. Pull up the investor deck right now, or I am calling the city procurement office on Monday morning to ask them what documents Victor Kessler has submitted in the last 30 days. Her face drained of color. With shaking hands, she unlocked her phone, opened a file-sharing application, and tapped on a portable document format file. She handed the phone to me as if it were a live grenade. I took the device and began to scroll. The document was a 40-page, high-resolution presentation. designed to court private equity partners for the municipal housing bid. It was polished, it was expensive, and it was built on a foundation of absolute fraud. On page 12, under the heading of Executive Leadership, I found myself staring at my own face. It was my professional headshot, lifted directly from my LinkedIn profile. Beneath the photo, in bold navy letters, read the title, Maxine Mayfield, Managing Partner, Mayfield Civic Renewal. The text below the title was a masterclass in fabricated corporate jargon. Maxine Mayfield spearheads our rigorous corporate compliance and risk management strategy. The paragraph boasted, bringing nearly a decade of top-tier procurement oversight to the municipal redevelopment sector. Her leadership ensures 100% regulatory adherence. They had not just used my name, they had weaponized my entire professional identity. They had taken the reputation I bled for in Chicago and pasted it onto their reckless gamble in Indiana to make themselves look legitimate to investors. "Get out," I said, tossing the phone back onto her lap. "Max, please, it is just a draft. Get out of my apartment, Delaney, right now." She scrambled to her feet, abandoning her coffee and the silver box, and practically ran out the door, the moment the lock clicked shut behind her. I picked up my own phone and dialed Tessa Vale. Tessa was at my apartment within 45 minutes. She read through the screenshots I had managed to send her before Delaney fled. Tessa was not just a friend, she was a senior auditor at a rival firm. She knew the mechanics of corporate deceit as intimately as I did. "Maxine," Tessa said, sitting at my kitchen island, her voice stripped of its usual vibrant humor. "This is not your family asking for an inappropriate favor anymore. This is identity theft. This is misrepresentation. They are using forged credentials to solicit capital and influence a municipal bidding process." "I know," I breathed, pacing the length of the kitchen. "I need a lawyer. A ruthless one." By 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room in the financial district, across from Lena Ortiz. Lena was a corporate litigator who specialized in white-collar defense and partner disputes. She had sharp eyes, a perpetually unimpressed expression, and a billing rate that made my stomach churn. I handed her the printed pages of the investor deck. Lena reviewed the documents in silence. When she finished, she opened her laptop. "If they are circulating this to private equity, there is a paper trail," she noted crisply. "Let us look at the State Business Registry portal. If Mayfield Civic Renewal exists as a legal entity, we need to know who filed the articles of organization." I sat rigidly in my chair while Lena typed. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard sounded like a ticking clock. I watched her screen as she navigated through the Indiana Secretary of State database. She typed in the name of the company. A result populated immediately. "Here it is," Lena said, her eyes scanning the digital record. "Mayfield Civic Renewal, a limited liability company. When was it formed?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Last week." "No," Lena replied, zooming in on the filing date. "It was registered exactly 18 months ago." The air in the room grew instantly colder. 18 months? "Who is listed as the registered agent?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lena clicked a link to download the original articles of organization. A scanned document appeared on the screen. She turned the laptop toward me. "You are," she said. I leaned in. The paperwork listed my name as the sole managing member. But what caught my eye and stopped the breath in my lungs was the address. It was not my current apartment. It was the address of the crumbling, cramped studio apartment on the south side of Chicago where I had lived 3 years ago. "Scroll down," I told Lena. "Show me the signature page." She scrolled to the final page of the document. At the bottom, next to the date, was an electronic signature. I stared at the digital ink. It was my name, but the handwriting was slightly off. The loop of the first letter was too wide. The slant of the last letter was too sharp. It was not the tight, controlled signature I use now to sign off on massive compliance audits. It was the signature I used when I was 22 years old. My mind violently pulled me back 8 years in the past. It was the week after my grandmother passed away. I had driven back to Indiana for the funeral. We were sitting in the dining room, surrounded by casserole dishes and sympathy flowers. My mother had placed a thick stack of manila folders in front of me. "Just some simple estate papers, Maxie," she had said, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Victor is handling the probate with the lawyers. We just need your signature on these releases so we can process the inheritance and close her accounts. Sign on the sticky notes." I had trusted her. I was grieving. I was young, and I was still desperately trying to be the helpful, easy daughter. I had signed every page she put in front of me without reading a single paragraph. They had kept that signature. They had scanned it, digitized it, and saved it. "Do you recognize this?" Lena asked, watching the color drain from my face. "It is my signature," I whispered, the nausea finally hitting me. But I did not sign this document. My mother had me sign blank releases for an estate settlement 8 years ago. They repurposed the electronic file. Lena closed the laptop, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to predatory focus. "Maxine, this means they did not just misrepresent you on a glossy brochure. They filed fraudulent documents with the state government using stolen biographical data and a forged signature." The twist hit me with the force of a physical blow, realigning everything I thought I knew about the last 7 days. The frantic phone call last week, the aggressive push for me to agree to be the majority owner, Victor's outrage when I refused, my mother calling me dramatic. They had not been calling to ask me to start a dirty game. They had been calling to secure my retroactive consent. The municipal bid required an in-person compliance interview or a notarized affidavit from the managing partner. They had hit a bureaucratic wall they could not fake their way through. They did not need my permission to begin the fraud. They needed my signature to patch up a fraudulent scheme that had been running quietly and illegally under my name for 1.5 years. For the next 14 days, my life became a blur of discovery motions and subpoenaed financial ledgers. I treated my family's history the same way I treated a hostile corporate vendor. I built a forensic timeline. Lena Ortiz was a surgeon with a subpoena. We forced Victor to turn over the last 5 years of corporate tax returns, operating statements, and bank records under the threat of an immediate injunction against the city bid. The documents arrived in my inbox in heavily encrypted batches. I sat at my dining table until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing balance sheets with vendor invoices, letting the cold logic of the numbers replace the chaotic grief in my chest. The illusion of the Kessler family empire evaporated in the span of 4 hours. Victor was not a successful patriarch building a legacy. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own financial incompetence. The company was hemorrhaging cash. I tracked catastrophic cost overruns on 3 recent suburban developments that had forced Victor to take out predatory, high-interest mezzanine loans just to keep the lights on in his office. He was borrowing against his future to pay for his past, creating a massive, unsustainable shell game. The ledgers told a brutal story of parasitism. I traced a series of massive wire transfers out of the primary operating account directly into a holding company registered to Braden. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of corporate funds had been siphoned off to pay for the designer lighting, the custom mahogany bar, and the aggressive marketing campaign for his new restaurant chain. He was posing as a self-made entrepreneur on social media, lecturing his followers about the grind, completely bankrolled by money Victor did not actually have. Delaney was no better. Her entire glamorous lifestyle was categorized under corporate marketing and public relations expenses. The invoices were staggering: $5,000 for a charity gala table, $2,000 a month for a personal publicist, wardrobe pulls, luxury travel expenses, and high-end photography sessions were all written off as necessary expenditures for the company image, while the actual business suffocated under the weight of her vanity. But the most damning discovery was the scope of Mayfield's civic renewal. The entity they had forged in my name was not a one-time desperation play for the current municipal bid. I found pitch decks and email chains dating back 18 months. They had been parading my credentials around private equity circles for 1.5 years. I was their shiny ethical badge, the brilliant female compliance executive they used to open doors that Victor's mediocre, debt-ridden reputation could never unlock on its own. They had monetized my integrity. The current project they were pursuing was the final, fatal gamble. I pulled the public request for proposal from the city archives. This was not a standard commercial build. The millions of dollars Victor was chasing came from a federally subsidized reintegration housing initiative meant for veterans and low-income workers. The money came with excruciatingly strict oversight standards. Stealing from private investors was one thing. Defrauding a government housing initiative was a fast track to a federal indictment. 2 days later, my phone rang from an unknown Indiana number. I answered it cautiously. "Maxine," a hushed, trembling voice said. "It is Ruth Ellison." Ruth was Victor's office manager. She had been sitting at the front desk of that company since I was in high school, managing the filing cabinets and making the coffee. "Hello, Ruth," I said. "Are you calling on behalf of Victor?" "No," she whispered, the sound of a heavy wooden door closing echoing behind her. "He does not know I am calling you, Maxine. Things are very bad down here. He is moving money around in ways I do not understand, but the operating accounts are completely empty. 3 of our primary framing subcontractors have not been paid in 60 days. They are threatening to walk off the job sites. A few of the junior estimators are terrified our next payroll is going to bounce. He keeps telling everyone a massive city contract is going to clear all the debts next month. Is that true?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the disaster pressing down on my shoulders. "No, Ruth, it is not true. Do not trust the payroll. Update your resume today." I hung up the phone and opened the latest batch of internal emails Lena had managed to extract from their server. I searched my own name. I waded through hundreds of mundane logistical threads until I hit a conversation between Victor and my mother, dated the morning after our explosive phone call. Victor had written, "She is going to blow the city deal. We need a backup signatory." My mother had replied 20 minutes later. Her response was a single line. "Keep Max's name warm until she calms down. She always comes around eventually." I stared at the glowing screen. I read the words until the letters lost their meaning. Keep my name warm. Like an engine left idling. Like a piece of meat on a stove. There was no guilt in her typing. There was no panic about the legal boundary they had crossed. There was only strategy. She fundamentally believed my compliance was inevitable, that my anger was just a temporary tantrum that would subside once I remembered my proper place as the family safety net. That sentence was colder than any outright denial or screaming match could ever be. Then, the final blow landed. It was buried deep in a supplementary schedule of assets tied to Victor's most recent high-interest loan. I was scanning the list of collateralized properties when a familiar address stopped my heart and pushed all the air out of my lungs. It was the duplex, my grandmother's old duplex. When my grandmother died, she left the property to me. My mother had handed me those blank releases 8 years ago, claiming Victor was handling the simple transfer of the deed into a trust for my future. I had believed her. I had signed the sticky notes without reading the fine print. Now, looking at the loan schedule, I saw the absolute truth. They had not put the duplex in a trust. They had used the forged power of attorney to roll the property into a cross-collateralization structure to secure Victor's massive corporate debt. A cross-collateralization clause is a financial death trap. It meant if Victor defaulted on a commercial warehouse loan, the bank could seize the duplex to cover the spread. I had never been notified. I had never received a cent of equity. My only inheritance, the only tangible piece of my grandmother I had left in the world, was currently serving as the final sandbag holding back the flood of Victor's impending bankruptcy. I sat back in my chair. The anger that had been burning inside me shifted from a chaotic, personal rage into something utterly clinical and razor-sharp. The stakes had officially changed. This was no longer about a forgotten birthday cake. This was no longer about my hurt feelings or my desire to be loved, and my family was operating a sinking ship built on systematic fraud, and they had chained my name, my reputation, and my inheritance to the anchor. If this house of cards collapsed, the innocent subcontractors Ruth warned me about would lose their livelihoods, the city would lose housing for vulnerable veterans, and I would be dragged down into the wreckage, facing prison time for crimes I did not commit, all because I had spent my entire life trying to be the easy daughter. The leather armchair in Dr. Mara Fenwick's office smelled like cedar and old paper. The room was soundproofed, entirely separated from the screaming sirens and grinding gears of downtown Chicago. For the first time in my life, I was paying someone specifically to listen to me, and the experience was terrifying. I spent the first 2 sessions reciting the logistical timeline of my family's fraud, laying out the legal structure of the stolen identity like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. Dr. Fenwick let me talk. She listened to my meticulous breakdown of limited liability companies and cross-collateralization clauses without interrupting. But during our 3rd session, she leaned forward, rested her forearms on her knees, and quietly dismantled my entire defense mechanism. You are analyzing the crime to avoid feeling the grief, Maxine, Doctor? Fenwick said, her voice gentle but impossibly sharp. You are an expert at risk management. So tell me, why did they think you were a safe risk? I stared at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath my boots. They used you as the safe harbor because you trained them to, she continued softly. People park their absolute worst behavior in your life because they know you will never generate enough waves to capsize them. You have spent 30 years making sure your reactions are small enough to fit inside their comfort zone. The truth of her words felt like a physical puncture wound. Over the next month, the therapy sessions forced me to confront the darkest, most humiliating part of this entire ordeal. The most agonizing realization was not the identity theft itself, or the forged signature on the state registry portal. The true pain was acknowledging that, deep down in the bedrock of my soul, I had secretly wanted to be used. I had allowed them to strip mine my time, my skills, and my energy because I harbored a pathetic, lingering hope that if I just fixed one more spreadsheet, if I just saved one more project, they would finally grant me a seat at the table. I had to learn the excruciating difference between being a genuinely kind person and voluntarily offering myself up as a human landing pad for selfish people to crash onto. I refused to let anger be the only thing I took away from this betrayal. I decided to restructure my own foundation before I tore theirs down. My newfound psychological boundaries began to bleed into my professional life at Meridian Corridor Group. The chronic, deeply ingrained need to soften my language vanished entirely. I stopped using phrases like, I think, or maybe we should, in my compliance reports. When a senior vice president tried to aggressively push a questionable vendor contract through the system without the required secondary screening, I did not write a polite, deferential email outlining my concerns. I walked directly into his glass-walled office, dropped the unapproved file onto his desk, and told him the contract was a regulatory liability and I would not authorize it. He stared at me, completely stunned by the absolute lack of hesitation in my voice. He did not argue. 3 days later, the director of operations called me into a meeting and promoted me to lead a massive internal risk assessment team, citing my exceptional clarity and unwavering judgment under pressure. The very traits my family had exploited in the shadows were finally being rewarded in the light. That weekend, the universe offered me a different kind of validation. On a rainy Saturday evening, Tessa and Noah ambushed me in the lobby of my apartment building. They did not take me to an extravagant nightclub, and there was no towering champagne pyramid. We walked 3 blocks through the drizzle to a small, dimly lit Thai restaurant tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore. 3 other close friends from my college days were already waiting in a corner booth. There were no grand speeches. There was just a steaming plate of green curry with a single, unlit candle stuck directly into a mound of jasmine rice. Noah handed me a first edition hardcover book I had briefly mentioned wanting over 2 months ago. Tessa gave me a small, beautifully framed photograph of the 2 of us from a hiking trip we had taken 5 years prior. I sat in the warm, noisy restaurant, surrounded by people who did not need my signature or my compliance expertise. I listened to their laughter blending with the clatter of silverware. For the first time in my 30 years on Earth, I truly understood the profound, quiet luxury of being remembered without having to remind anyone that I existed. But the healing was only half the battle. The war was still waiting. On a Tuesday morning, I sat in Lena Ortiz's office and officially authorized the legal strike. Lena drafted a formal, devastatingly precise cease and desist letter. It demanded the immediate cessation of any use of my name, my professional likeness, and my forged signature across all corporate and municipal channels. It included a strict, legally binding litigation hold, ordering Victor Kessler and his entire executive team to preserve every single email, financial ledger, internal memo, and text message related to Mayfield Civic renewal. The final paragraph was the kill shot. It explicitly warned that any further submission of municipal bids containing my fabricated credentials would result in immediate notification to the Federal Housing Authority and the State Attorney General's Office for criminal fraud investigation. We sent the package via certified mail, requiring Victor's direct signature upon delivery. The explosion happened exactly 48 hours later. My phone began to ring incessantly on Thursday afternoon. Victor left 4 increasingly frantic voicemails before I finally answered the 5th incoming call. "Maxine? Honey, what in the world is this piece of paper?" Victor started. His voice was dripping with an artificial, panicked sweetness, as if we were discussing a slight misunderstanding over a restaurant bill. "It is a legal directive, Victor," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Read it carefully." When I remained silent and refused to offer him an easy out, the sugary facade instantly dissolved into pure venom. "You ungrateful little brat," Victor snarled, his voice echoing loudly over the speaker. "You are going to destroy your own blood over a stupid birthday. You are going to burn down the entire family legacy, ruin Braden's future, and bankrupt us all just because you felt left out of a party. Do you have any idea what you are doing to your mother?" I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my birthday. If the family legacy is built on a forged electronic signature and federal wire fraud, Victor, then it deserves to burn. Do not call this number again unless your lawyer's on the line. I hung up. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up with my mother's name. I answered. For the first time in my entire life, I heard Elaine Mayfield cry real, unrestrained tears over the telephone. Her breathing was ragged, her voice cracking under the weight of genuine panic. But as I listened to her weep, the cold reality settled over me. She was not crying for me. "I just do not understand," my mother sobbed into the receiver, her words blurring together. "I did not think all of this would make you feel so heavy. Maxie, we were just trying to survive the market. We just needed a little help." I closed my eyes. It was a masterclass in emotional deflection. She was not apologizing for stealing my identity. She was not apologizing for risking my freedom or mortgaging my grandmother's duplex behind my back. She was apologizing for my reaction to her crimes. She was still desperately dodging the absolute core of the betrayal, framing herself as a victim of my unforeseen sensitivity. "Stop crying, Mom," I said. My tone was shockingly level, anchored by the weeks of therapy and the absolute certainty of my own reality. She choked on a sob, stunned into absolute silence by the command. I had never spoken to her that way. "Tears are not going to fix the supply chain of lies you have built," I told her quietly. "I am coming down to Indianapolis on Sunday. I will sit at the dining room table with you, Victor, Braden, and Delaney. But here are my non-negotiable terms. You will bring every single original corporate document. You will bring the absolute truth regarding the bank loans. And if any of you tries to turn this meeting into a guilt trip to force me to save you from your own consequences, I will stand up, walk out the front door, and drive straight to the state investigator's office to hand them my files." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, making sure she felt the absolute finality of my words. "Do you understand me, Mom?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice tiny and broken. "Good. See you on Sunday." The drive south from Chicago down Interstate 65 took 3 hours. I did not turn on the radio. I did not take any phone calls. I controlled the silence in the car. pacing my own breathing, refusing to let anyone in my family dictate the rhythm of this return. I pulled into the driveway of the suburban house I had spent my teenage years trying to escape. They used to boast about this property constantly, treating it as the ultimate symbol of their middle-class stability and success. Now, standing on the driveway, I saw the rot they had been desperately hiding. The physical decay mirrored the financial ruin perfectly. The front lawn, usually manicured by a landscaping crew, was uneven and overrun with weeds. The concrete on the bottom porch step was severely chipped. Underneath the eaves, in the corners where casual guests rarely looked, the pristine white paint was bubbling and peeling away in long gray strips. The facade was crumbling. I did not knock. I used the brass key I still kept on my ring and pushed the heavy front door open. The house was unnervingly quiet. I walked straight into the formal dining room. They were already seated, arranged around the long mahogany table like a desperate, suburban jury waiting to pass a verdict on my loyalty. Victor sat at the head of the table. My mother sat to his right, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Braden was slouched in his chair on the left, tapping nervously on his phone, while Delaney sat perfectly upright, looking as though she was about to face a firing squad. I did not greet them. I did not ask how their week was. I walked to the opposite end of the table, dropped my heavy leather tote bag onto the floor, and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. Victor cleared his throat, attempting to summon his usual booming patriarchal authority. He forced a stiff conciliatory smile. "Maxine, thank you for making the drive. I know things got a little heated over the phone last week, but I want to assure you, this entire situation is just a massive procedural misunderstanding. It is a clerical oversight that spiraled out of proportion before we could explain it to you." I did not sit down. I stared at him across the polished wood. "A procedural misunderstanding," I repeated, my voice devoid of any inflection. I opened my folder. I took out the first document and slid it down the length of the table. This is the timeline of the limited liability company registered in my name 18 months ago. I slid a second document. This is the investor deck circulated to private equity firms last fall, listing me as your managing partner. I slid a third piece of paper, a blown-up image of the electronic authorization. And this is the forged signature used to bypass the state registry. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward. The dining room felt as pressurized as a submarine diving too deep. "There is no misunderstanding. Victor, you stole my identity. You committed fraud." Braden stopped tapping his phone. He rolled his eyes, a gesture of profound, entitled annoyance that he had carried since childhood. "Come on, Max," he muttered, shifting in his seat. "You are acting like we sold your social security number on the dark web. I saw your name on the pitch deck months ago. I knew about it. We all figured you would eventually agree to it anyway because you never make things complicated. You never blow things up. You are always the one who fixes the paperwork. Why is this suddenly a massive issue?" I turned my cold gaze to my stepbrother. "Because fixing your terrible grammar in an email is not the same thing as taking the fall for federal wire fraud. Braden." Delaney suddenly buried her face in her hands and began to cry. It was not the elegant, camera-ready crying she usually performed for sympathy. It was ugly, panicked, and entirely real. "I just wanted us to be together," she sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I thought if you were officially part of the business, you would come home more. Mom said you would be thrilled when we finally told you. She said it back in November when the bank started calling." The dining room went dead quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Delaney froze, dropping her hands from her face, realizing what she had just confessed. I slowly turned my head away from my sobbing stepsister and locked eyes with my mother. Elaine's face was the color of chalk. Her hands were trembling so violently she had to press them flat against the table to keep them still. "November," I said, the word dropping into the silence like an anvil. "You knew about this in November. You knew before the city bid. You knew before my birthday." My mother swallowed hard. She looked at Victor, silently pleading for him to intervene. But Victor was staring at the documents on the table, calculating his own survival. She was entirely on her own. The commercial lenders were threatening to call in Victor's mezzanine loans, Elaine whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. They wanted to restructure the debt immediately, but they demanded a stronger compliance profile for the holding company to approve the extension. Victor was desperate. We were going to lose everything. Maxie. The house, the business, everything. So you gave him my signature, I stated. It was not a question. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her carefully applied makeup. I told him where the old estate files were, she confessed, her voice thick with shame. I told him he could use the digital copies of your signature from your grandmother's probate. I thought it was just for internal bank restructuring. I did not know he was going to use it for a city contract. I did it for us. Max, I did it for the family. We had to protect what we built. I thought you would understand that sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. I stood perfectly still. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. The most profound, world-shattering pain of my life did not come from Victor. Victor was a parasite, and parasites simply do what is in their nature to survive. The agonizing betrayal came from the woman sitting to his right. My own mother had watched me grieve my grandmother, handed me a stack of papers to sign, and then quietly handed that trust over to a desperate man to save her own comfortable suburban life. She had actively, consciously, crossed the boundary of my safety, and she had justified it to herself by pretending my sacrifice was for the greater good of a family that never even remembered my birthday. I am shutting it down, I said, my voice cutting through her tears. My lawyer has already drafted the injunction. I am removing my name from every single asset. I am unsealing the cross-collateralization on the duplex, and I am reporting the forgery to the state. Victor shot out of his chair, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. The polite, measured facade completely disintegrated. "You cannot do that," he roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the mahogany table. "We are out of time. The city procurement integrity hearing is in 10 days. I paused, my hand resting on the edge of my open folder. I looked at him, truly seeing the sheer panic in his eyes. "What hearing?" "The final review board," Braden interjected, his voice tight with genuine fear now. "The city flagged the ownership structure on the bid. They want the managing partner to appear in person. They want you to verify the compliance matrix under oath before they release the funds." They stared at me. All 4 of them looked at me from across the table. The absolute, breathtaking delusion of their plan finally became clear. They had not just stolen my name. They had orchestrated this entire meeting, absorbed my anger, and sat through my presentation because they genuinely, desperately believed that when the clock ran out, my lifelong conditioning would override my fury. They thought the old Maxine, the quiet, compliant safety net, would return in the final hour. They fully expected me to walk into a government building in exactly 10 days, raise my right hand, and commit perjury in front of a city council to save them from their own lies. The assault began exactly 24 hours after I drove away from that dining room table in Indianapolis. It was a perfectly coordinated, relentless siege. My phone ceased to be a tool for communication. It became a weapon of mass guilt. They did not attack me with direct threats. They attacked me with the heavy, suffocating pressure of familial obligation. Uncle David, a man who had not remembered to send me a single holiday card in over a decade, left a 3-minute voicemail calling me a disgrace. Aunt Sarah sent a long, rambling text message at 2 a.m. She wrote that my mother was a nervous wreck, that Victor's blood pressure was dangerously high, and she demanded to know how I could be so incredibly heartless. Former business partners of Victor, men I had met exactly once at a summer barbecue 15 years ago, suddenly found my number. The script was identical across every single call and message. They told me the family was in a catastrophic crisis. They told me I was destroying a legacy over a simple misunderstanding. They demanded I show some compassion. Braden, true to his nature, bypassed the direct approach and took the war public. He posted a vague, melodramatic, black and white photograph on his social media accounts. The caption was a masterclass in manipulation. It read, "Nothing hurts more than an inside trader right when the company needs unity the most. Blood is supposed to be thicker than water. Trying to keep the empire standing while dealing with knives in my back." He cast himself as the tragic, hard-working victim. He positioned me as the villain before I ever had the chance to speak a single word in public. To his thousands of followers, I was the selfish, bitter sister trying to ruin his self-made success story out of pure jealousy. The conditioning of 30 years is a remarkably heavy chain to break. For 48 agonizing hours, I genuinely wavered. I sat on my sofa in Chicago, staring blindly at the television screen, feeling the walls of my resolve cracking. I pictured the suburban house going into foreclosure. I saw my mother, stripped of her comfortable routine, packing her expensive clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. I imagined Victor's public humiliation in the country club dining room. The sheer, overwhelming weight of their collective ruin hovered right above my finger. All I had to do was surrender. All I had to do was walk into that hearing, smile at the city officials, say yes to the committee, and the pain would instantly stop. I could save them. I could go back to being the quiet, easy daughter. The temptation to fold, to simply absorb their sins to keep the peace, was a physical ache radiating through my chest. On the 5th day of the countdown, the universe intervened. A thick, heavily padded manila envelope arrived at my office via priority overnight courier. There was no return address on the label. Inside, there was a handwritten note clipped to the top of a massive stack of copied papers. The note read, "You need to see the rest of it before you decide. I am so sorry, Ruth." I locked my office door and spread the documents across my desk. The financial rot was infinitely worse than Lena Ortiz and I had initially uncovered. Ruth had sent me the raw, unfiltered truth of the Kessler Company. There were final past due notices from local lumberyards, heavily circled in red ink. There were desperate, pleading emails from independent drywall contractors begging Victor for just a partial payment so they could afford to feed their own families. There were internal payroll schedules showing that the administrative staff had their wages delayed for 3 consecutive pay periods. But the most damning evidence was a series of municipal diversity reporting forms. I found documents where Victor had manually crossed out the original ownership percentages with a thick black marker. He had written my name and 51% ownership in his own jagged handwriting, deliberately falsifying the forms to hit the women-owned business quota. Then, at the very bottom of the stack, I found the internal memorandum. It was dated exactly 3 days before my 30th birthday. Victor had sent it to his chief financial officer. The text was blunt and terrifying. "Draft a retroactive consent form for Maxine." Victor wrote, "We will backdate it to 18 months ago. If she balks, we will simply tell her the filing is already processed with the state, and she has no choice but to play along." They had never intended to ask for my help. They had intended to trap me in a legal corner. I scanned the memorandum and sent it directly to Lena. She called me back within 5 minutes. Her voice possessed a grim, terrifying urgency. "Maxine, the entire legal landscape just shifted," Lena stated flatly. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. If you do not attend this municipal integrity hearing, or if you sit in that chair and remain silent to protect them, you are no longer just a victim of identity theft. The City Procurement Board will view your silence as implied legal consent. If you let this bid process move forward knowing your signature was forged, you cross the line from a victim to an active co-conspirator. You will carry the direct, unavoidable legal liability for defrauding a government housing initiative." I was completely backed against a wall. If I spoke the truth, I destroyed my family. If I stayed silent, I destroyed myself and went to federal prison. I took an emergency session with Dr. Mara Fenwick that same afternoon. I sat in her leather chair, my hands trembling violently, the weight of the impending destruction crushing my lungs. I looked at her, entirely stripped of my corporate armor. "I feel like a traitor," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Doctor." Fenwick did not offer me a soft, comforting smile. She offered me a lifeline forged from pure steel. Telling the truth is not a betrayal. Maxine, she said, her voice piercing through the panic in my mind. Forcing others to live with your lies is the betrayal. Your family built a massive house on a severe fault line. You are not the one causing the earthquake. You are simply refusing to stand inside the house when the roof inevitably collapses. The fog in my brain instantly vanished. The crushing, suffocating guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, purely tactical clarity. I was not the villain, I was the consequence. Lena and I spent the next 4 days turning her conference room into a war room. We were not preparing a dramatic, emotional performance for the city council. We were preparing a surgical, legal execution. We organized the documents into a strict, unassailable timeline. We tied every single forged signature to a corresponding internal email. We linked every altered diversity metric to a delayed payroll schedule. I memorized the dates, the bank account numbers, the municipal compliance codes, and the specific names of the defrauded subcontractors. I prepared to speak every detail at the exact right moment, with the exact right document, wielding the maximum legal weight. I also forced Lena to draft a highly specific, conditional exit strategy. It was a legally binding settlement framework. If my family cooperated with the state investigation and voluntarily liquidated their assets without a prolonged court battle, I would direct the board to prioritize the true victims. The capital from the sale of the corporate heavy equipment, the warehouse properties, and the forced sale of Braden's restaurant shares would go directly to paying Ruth, the office staff, and the small, independent contractors. Braden would lose his vanity project, Delaney would lose her corporate public relations budget. The money would bypass the family entirely and go directly to the people whose labor they had stolen. The night before the hearing arrived, it was 9 o'clock. My black suit was pressed and hung on the door. My briefcase was packed with 3 identical binders of evidence. I was sitting at my kitchen island, staring out at the grid of Chicago lights, feeling a strange, profound calm. My phone buzzed against the quartz countertop. It was a single voicemail notification. The caller ID showed my mother's number. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The audio crackled slightly. Maxie, Elaine's voice drifted through the small speaker. It was entirely stripped of the usual, frantic sugar. It was stripped of the defensive manipulation. She sounded incredibly old and unimaginably tired. "I am not calling to ask you to lie tomorrow," she whispered into the phone, her breath catching in her throat. "I know it is too late for that. I just wanted to say it out loud to you before everything changes forever. I saw what Victor was doing. I saw the papers on his desk. I chose what was easy. Maxine, I did not choose what was right. I am so incredibly sorry." The line clicked dead. I sat in the silence of my apartment. It was the closest thing to the absolute truth my mother had ever spoken to me in 30 years. It was a genuine admission of her own cowardice, but as I looked at my briefcase, full of the evidence of her betrayal, I realized the apology was exactly 24 hours too late to stop what was coming. I turned off my phone, stood up, and turned out the lights. Tomorrow, the safety net was going to break, and I was going to let them all fall. The Indianapolis Central Administration Building was a towering monument to bureaucratic indifference. The fluorescent lighting was aggressively bright, bouncing off the polished linoleum floors and the pale gray walls with a harsh, unblinking glare. It was far too clean, too sterile, and far too emotionally vacant to serve as the container for the massive volume of deceit we were about to unpack inside it. We were assigned to a hearing room on the 4th floor. The air conditioning hummed loudly, chilling the room to a temperature that felt physically punishing. There were no windows, just 4 solid walls of municipal authority waiting to process a disaster. Victor Kessler walked through the heavy double oak doors wearing his absolute best tailored navy suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his posture rigidly straight. Braden walked closely beside him, armed with a highly rehearsed, blindingly white businessman's smile. They strode down the center aisle with the manufactured confidence of men who genuinely believed they still controlled the narrative. They looked at me, seated quietly at the witness table beside Lena Ortiz, and offered tight, patronizing nods. They were putting on a performance for the room, acting as though my presence was merely a formality, a quick trip to clear up a minor misunderstanding before the city released the funds. They still, against all logic, thought I was going to save them. I did not return their nods. I simply looked over my shoulder at the 3 rows of public seating positioned directly behind the wooden barricade. The audience had fundamentally shifted the gravity of the room from a private domestic dispute to a highly public execution. Ruth Ellison sat in the second row, clutching a worn leather handbag against her chest. Next to her were 2 administrative assistants from Victor's office, looking exhausted and terrified about their missing paychecks. In the back row sat 3 independent framing contractors in heavy work boots and denim jackets, men who had not seen a single dollar of payment in over 60 days. There were also 2 representatives from the City Housing Authority holding thick clipboards. These people made the stakes undeniable. This was no longer a story about a daughter feeling neglected. It was a crime scene with living, breathing casualties. The 5 members of the City Procurement Integrity Board sat elevated behind a curved mahogany bench. The chairperson, a stern woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a thick stack of manila folders in front of her, called the session to order at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. She read the docket number, the name of the Municipal Housing Reintegration Initiative, and the entity under official review, Mayfield Civic Renewal. The chairperson adjusted her microphone, her sharp gaze dropping down to my table. "Miss Mayfield," she began, her voice echoing sharply through the room's sound system. "You are listed on all submitted municipal bid documents as the 51% majority owner and managing member of Mayfield Civic Renewal. Can you please confirm for the official record that you hold this operational and legal role?" The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. I could feel Victor staring at the side of my face, his desperation radiating across the aisle, practically willing me to say yes. I could feel Braden's suffocating expectation. They needed exactly 1 word. They needed 1 single syllable to validate 18 months of fraud and release millions of dollars in taxpayer funds into their drowning corporate bank accounts. They were waiting for the safety net to catch them one last time. I did not give them their rhythm. I did not offer a quick answer to end their anxiety. I slowly adjusted the microphone on my desk, pulled it closer, and opened the thick black binder Lena had prepared. "Madam Chairperson," I said, my voice steady, cold, and amplified across the sterile room. "Before I can confirm any legal designation regarding ownership or operational control, I must formally request to sequence the supporting documentation, establish a chronological timeline of filings, and enter several unapproved appendices into the official record." The chairperson frowned slightly, exchanging a confused look with the councilman to her right, but she gave a curt nod. "Proceed. Ms. Mayfield." I did not look at my family. I looked only at the board. I began to lay the pieces on the table, speaking with the absolute precision of an auditor conducting a financial autopsy. First, Lena handed the clerk the state registry filing from 18 months ago. I pointed out the registered address, stating for the record that it was a former residence I had vacated 3 full years prior to the document's creation. Next, I introduced the private equity investor deck. I read aloud the fabricated summary of my career, dissecting the exact nature of the lies printed beneath my stolen corporate headshot. I submitted the internal email correspondence between Victor and his chief financial officer. I read the directive regarding the retroactive consent form, speaking the words slowly so the malicious intent hung heavily in the dead air of the hearing room. Finally, I presented the digital signature block. The electronic signature affixed to these municipal bid documents and the original articles of organization is a digital artifact, I explained, looking directly into the eyes of the chairperson. "It was harvested without my knowledge or consent from a set of unrelated estate probate releases signed 8 years ago following the death of my grandmother." The chairperson leaned forward, her expression hardening from bureaucratic neutrality to absolute alarm. "Ms. Mayfield," she asked, her tone dropping an octave, abandoning the script entirely, "are you stating under oath that you did not authorize these municipal filings?" "I am swearing under oath," I replied, my voice ringing with total clarity. That I have never agreed to hold an operational, financial, or substantive ownership role for Mayfield Civic renewal. I had absolutely no knowledge of this entity's existence at the time these documents were utilized to manipulate the diversity scoring matrix and access federal housing funds. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the distinct sound of a structural collapse. I finally turned my head to look at the defense table. Victor Kessler's face had completely fractured. The arrogant, patriarchal mask shattered into 1,000 pieces, leaving behind the pale, sweating features of a man who suddenly realized he had lost everything. Braden had completely lost his rehearsed rhythm. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an emergency exit that did not exist. But it was my mother who captured my attention. Elaine sat rigidly in her chair. She was not crying. There were no theatrical sobs, no trembling hands reaching out for sympathy. She sat folded into herself, looking incredibly small, as the undeniable reality finally crushed the last of her delusions. She understood, in that blindingly bright room, that her tears possessed absolutely no currency here. The truth could not be washed away with a polite apology. She was watching the exact moment the life she knew ended. The chairperson struck her gavel loudly, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot against the walls. She announced an immediate 30-minute recess to allow the board's legal counsel to review the newly submitted evidence and consult directly with the state attorney general's office regarding criminal fraud. The room erupted into a chaotic murmur. Lena began organizing our files, her face a mask of professional satisfaction. I stood up and walked out the heavy oak doors into the sprawling, marble-floored corridor, desperately needing to breathe air that did not smell like fear. The hallway was crowded with people rushing to make phone calls, but I felt a sudden, sharp grip on my forearm. I turned to see my mother. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails biting into my jacket. She did not look at me with pleading eyes. She looked at me with the desperate intensity of someone standing on the edge of a cliff. She pulled me away from the crowd, dragging me into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the stairwell. "Maxine," Elaine whispered, her voice a ragged, breathless rasp. "Before we go back in there is one final truth. Something Victor does not even know I have discovered." We stood in the cold, shadowed alcove of the municipal building hallway. The heavy marble walls seemed to press in on us, amplifying the suffocating weight of the moment. Elaine could not meet my eyes. She stared down at the polished floor, her breathing shallow and erratic, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her leather purse. "Victor did not just take the estate files and scan your signature on his own," she whispered, the words scraping painfully against her throat. "The digital registry portal required an initial, verified authorization. They needed a signed power of attorney to establish him as a legal proxy for the upload. He could not forge that first step without a witness." She finally looked up. Her eyes were wide, haunted by the crushing gravity of her own confession. "I signed it, Maxine. I signed as the witness. I authorized the proxy so he could use your name." The revelation did not cause an explosion of anger inside my chest. Instead, it brought a profound, freezing clarity. This was the deepest, most lethal cut of all. For my entire adult life, I had viewed my mother as a passive participant in the Kessler family dynamic. I thought she was simply too weak to stand up to Victor's overbearing personality. I thought she was a victim of his aggressive ambition, but she was not weak. In the exact moment her new, comfortable, affluent life was threatened by commercial debt, she made a deliberate, calculated choice. She actively stepped over the boundary of her own daughter's safety and handed Victor the key to my identity. She did not just look the other way. She paved the road for him. When the heavy oak door swung open 30 minutes later, I walked back into the hearing room with absolutely nothing left to protect. I took my seat next to Lena Ortiz. The chairperson called the room back to order, the sharp crack of her gavel cutting through the tension. She looked directly at me over the rim of her steel glasses. "Ms. Mayfield," the chairperson said, her tone dead serious, The board needs to understand the exact chain of authorization regarding the limited liability company. How was the digital signature initially authenticated for the municipal bid? There was a time, not very long ago, when I would have swallowed the truth to spare my mother the public humiliation. But the girl who absorbed the pain for everyone else no longer existed. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject any theatrical venom or dramatic revenge into my tone. I simply spoke the absolute, undeniable truth, layer by heavy layer. The initial digital proxy was established using a fraudulent power of attorney, I stated clearly into the microphone. The document was orchestrated by Victor Kessler and actively signed, witnessed, and authorized by my mother, Elaine Mayfield. A collective gasp rippled through the public seating behind me. At the defense table, Elaine closed her eyes and lowered her head, finally accepting the blow. Victor stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, his face a portrait of total, inescapable ruin. Before the board could ask another question, Lena stood up. She did not give them a single inch of breathing room. She formally submitted our final stack of exhibits into the public record. She handed the clerk the evidence preservation letter. She submitted the printed copy of the internal email from Elaine instructing Victor to keep my name warm until I calmed down. She handed over the sworn affidavit from Ruth Ellison, detailing the unpaid wages and the manually falsified diversity reports. Finally, Lena meticulously laid out the paper trail proving I had immediately objected and demanded the cessation of the fraud the exact moment I discovered it. The narrative was airtight. There was absolutely no room left for Victor to spin the facts into a misunderstanding. The chairperson did not even need to call for another recess to deliberate. The sheer volume and absolute clarity of the evidence demanded immediate action. Based on the sworn testimony and the verified internal communications provided, the chairperson announced, her voice echoing with administrative finality, this procurement board immediately and permanently disqualifies the Mayfield Civic renewal bid. Furthermore, we are freezing all pending municipal disbursements connected to any Kessler commercial entity. The board is formally referring this entire matter to the State Attorney General for a full criminal fraud investigation. Victor slumped in his chair. It was as if the invisible spine of his patriarchal authority had been surgically removed. The chairperson was not finished. Additionally, she stated, looking directly at the city housing representatives in the back row, we are placing a formal administrative lien on the Kessler corporate assets. Any forced liquidation or bankruptcy proceedings must legally prioritize the immediate payment of all outstanding employee salaries and the settlement of debts owed to the independent subcontractors. The fallout was not cinematic. It was a slow, crushing administrative execution. Within 48 hours, the commercial lenders completely stripped Victor of his operational control over his company. The holding structure collapsed inward. To satisfy the cross-collateralized debts and keep Victor out of a federal penitentiary, Braden was forced into an emergency liquidation of his restaurant chain. He had to sell 80% of his shares to a corporate hospitality group at a massive loss just to cover the bank margins. He lost his vanity project, his title, and his carefully curated social media empire overnight. Delaney, stripped of the corporate public relations budget that funded her lavish lifestyle, was suddenly forced to navigate a reality where she could no longer use a perfectly staged family photograph as makeup to cover the ugly truth of their lives. I did not stay to watch them pack up their offices. After the hearing concluded, I waited for Elaine on the wide concrete steps outside the municipal building. The Indianapolis air was sharp and cold. When she walked out, she looked exhausted, stripped of all her suburban armor. I turned to face her. I am going back to Chicago. Mom, she nodded slowly, clutching her coat tight against her chest. I know, I am sorry. Maxine. I truly am. If there is ever going to be a relationship between us again, I told her, my voice calm and completely steady. It does not start today, and it only starts under 3 strict conditions. First, absolute honesty, without any defensive deflections. Second, You go to real, consistent psychological therapy to figure out why you were willing to sacrifice your own child for a house. And third, you never, ever use the word family as a tool to force my compliance again. She did not argue. She did not cry. She just nodded one more time, accepting the terms of her own survival. The change did not happen magically overnight. Real life does not work that way. But 3 months later, Elaine officially separated from Victor. She moved out of the sprawling, crumbling suburban house and rented a small, one-bedroom apartment across town. She found a licensed therapist and began the agonizingly slow work of untangling her own complicity. It was not a perfect redemption, but for the first time in my life, her efforts were not just empty promises designed to keep me quiet. Exactly 1 year later, the sun set over the Chicago skyline, casting a warm golden light through the windows of my apartment. It was the evening of my 31st birthday. There was no tearful, dramatic, grand reunion. There was no towering cake or forced family dinner. At exactly 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my mother. The conversation was short, a little awkward, but entirely genuine. Earlier that afternoon, I had opened my mailbox to find a simple card. It was not signed by an assistant. It was not a group gift. It was a handwritten note from Elaine, written in her own steady hand. I placed the card on the kitchen island and walked into the living room. I did not leave my phone sitting face up on the counter. I did not sit in the quiet dark, waiting for the screen to light up with validation. I picked up my keys and walked out the door to meet Tessa and Noah for dinner. I was no longer the girl waiting to be remembered by a family that only loved my utility. I had finally chosen my own life, and the quiet was no longer a punishment. It was pure, unshakable peace. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and be heard by even more people.